Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all our attendees and participants, and welcome to the webinar on effective communications, lessons for responding to climate change and health pandemics. My name is Tara Caetano, and I will be your moderator for this session today. This webinar is hosted by ICLEI Africa in partnership with the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, as part of the Building Sustainable Cities during and after a pandemic webinar series. ICLEI Africa and partners explore pertinent issues faced by subnational governments in Africa through this series. We would like to thank our partners, the Covenant of Mayors, and the initiative's co-funders, the European Commission, BMZ, and ACID, for making today's webinar possible. In this webinar, experts in the field of communication, as well as leading decision makers from national, provincial, and local governments in African cities, come together to unpack the important questions that many in the urban sustainability industry are currently contemplating. The webinar will deep dive into two pioneering African cases and pull out tangible lessons. We will reflect on local challenges and opportunities and learn about successes and failures for replicability. We have an excellent lineup of speakers for today, starting with a live discussion between Ms. Rosalind Goodrich, Head of Research Communications at IIED, Ms. Karen Shippey, Chief Director of Environmental Sustainability at the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning here at the Western Cape Government in South Africa. As a brief overview of how the webinar will be run, we will have two live speakers with us, the two that I mentioned, and we will also have two pre-recorded sessions by Mr. Washington Zapata and engineer Festus from Nakuru County, the latter, and from Zimbabwe, the former. We've done some pre-recordings in order to hedge against connectivity issues that we might have had within Kenya and within Zimbabwe. This webinar is broadcast in both English and in French. If you look to the bottom of your screen, or you have a panel for Zoom, and you can either select your English or French interpretation in order to listen to the webinar in the language of choice. You also have the option to mute original audio if this audio is too loud and is disrupting your interpretation. We encourage great participation from all of you today. So please feel free to type the questions in for our speakers in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or in the webinar chat that you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. The benefit of using the Q&A function is that other attendees as part of this webinar can vote your question higher up the list, and making it more likely that we will be able to ask the question to our honorable guests. After the interventions from all of the speakers, we will then have the opportunity to have a live Q&A session where the participants will be able to answer the questions that we fielded throughout the webinar. Now it is my pleasure to hand over to Ms. Vanessa Vovor, who will introduce the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome, Ms. Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you to the whole ICLEI Africa team. I'm Vanessa Vovor, and I work for ComSSA at GIZ. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this already fourth webinar as part of our joint series with ICLEI Africa. So first, I would like to introduce a little bit of COMSA, the program, for those who are not familiar with it. So the Covenant of Mayors for Sub-Saharan Africa, COMSA in short, is a EU-funded project aiming to support Sub-Saharan African cities and region to mitigate and adapt to climate change, but also to improve access to clean and sustainable energy. And for the past 2 years, as GIZ, we had the pleasure to contribute to expanding the COMSA efforts to support local climate planning, implement relevant pilot projects, and supporting local governments to unlock climate financing, while also strengthening the city's exchanges. And this is where our webinar series stands out, because not only with this webinar series are we able to foster knowledge exchange between local governments, but we're able to do so by supporting African city stakeholders to find reliable sources of information during this pandemic. I would like to share with you a couple of exciting opportunities and activities that we are able to launch very soon, starting with the launch of a study on financial roadmaps that will support local governments in the development and financing of climate projects, which we will launch next month in just a matter of a couple of weeks. The study will be covering each stage of the project life cycle, from project identification to project development, finance, as well as operation. We will also be very excited to join the LOCS conference taking place from the 3rd to 12th of November on the theme Financing for Change, and registration will be open in a matter of a couple of weeks. So I actually warmly invite you to stay in touch and to stay up to date to all of our activities by either contacting the COMSSA help desk if you are an African local government, but also to follow us on social media, on our website, comssa.org, where you'll also be able to subscribe to our newsletter and not miss any news. I wish you a very great webinar and convey my warmest wishes on behalf of COMSA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. So now I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. We will be having a live conversation between Ms. Rosalind Goodrich and Ms. Karen Shippey. So first of all, to introduce Ms. Rosalind Goodrich, she is the Head of Research Communications at IIED. Rosalind works with IIED researchers and project partners to create strategic communication and engagement plans to complete their research work. These plans support projects to have the greatest possible impact with the resources available. In this role, Rosalind has worked extensively with government ministries across Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, as well as Central America. Ms. Karen Shippey is the Chief Director of the Environmental Sustainability Department. Mr. Karen Shippey is the Chief Director of Environmental Sustainability at the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning at the Western Cape Government, as I said, here in South Africa. She has 25 years of experience in the field of environmental management and sustainability. This includes 15 years as an environmental practitioner working with consultants in the environmental impact assessment field, doing environmental management and policy field, and also policy, as well as 10 years with provincial government. She is currently the Chief Director within her unit. We welcome both of them to this session today, and I would like to ask both of them to also please put on their videos, ready for our live conversation. Welcome both. Great, so maybe to start us off, I'd like to ask Rosalind, how is your work in particular linked to communication and dissemination of key research at IED shifted during this time of crisis?
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I was just gesticulating to someone who was about to come into the room and ask me a question. That's what that was at the beginning. I should say as well that IIED stands for the International Institute for Environment and Development, because I'm sure many of you may not have known that, and we're based in London. We work with a lot of partner organisations across African countries as well as elsewhere in the world. But to answer that question, so when I started at IIED about 7 years ago, we just launched a content portfolio, a sort of catalogue of publications, types of publications aimed at different audiences, some long, some short, but they were all predominantly print-based. Since then, we've started to develop more digital content. We've started to do more sort of short talking head videos. We've done quite a few short, say 3-minute long animations. We've done a new long read type digital piece, digital output, which is up to 4,000 words. It's like a very extended blog. But those were always sort of to support print content. So what we've seen predominantly since the COVID pandemic is that the speed of change has hugely increased. So now, in terms of the kinds of outputs we're aiming to produce, it's predominantly digital now, and digital outputs in their own right, as opposed to supporting print-based content. I mean, when we faced lockdown in the UK and obviously elsewhere, we decided in the communications group that we would put together a digital booster strategy, and that meant we would consciously do many more activities online, consciously produce content which was digital first. So we encouraged researchers, for example, to put their presentations that they might have been doing on a virtual meeting, to put them onto SlideShare. We'd had say one person do that last year. This year, since April, 20 presentations have gone online. We've done many more blogs. We've been more active on social media. Where we've postponed events, we've had to postpone live events. We've tried to do something to make up for that online. So we might have, say, an Instagram campaign to replace a key event, and that seems to be quite successful. There seems to be quite a lot of engagement. But of course, like most people, we've had a huge number of additional virtual meetings, Zoom meetings, webinars using other software, and so on. And those have been live streamed as well via Facebook, which broadens the audience potentially. And we've started to think not only webinars which are broadly sort of presentation based, but also we're beginning to experiment with virtual meetings which are more sort of workshop based, so much more interactive, breakout rooms, different sort of formats and so on. Again, you know, we're experimenting. We haven't mastered it yet, I'd say. And then in terms of content, we have focused since late February on a specific series around how the pandemic has affected the work our partners are doing. And we very much focused on those partners creating the content themselves, and it's being posted on our website. So a series of blogs, some multimedia content from partners in cities, in rural areas, and that seems to have worked quite well. They're not only describing what the situation is and how they're immediately coping with it, but they're also beginning now to say how they'd like things to change in the future. So the content has evolved over those months to be quite strategic, well, increasingly strategic. And so in terms of content as well, we've made the decision to do our annual review principally online. That's a huge change. We've always done a print copy before this. And recently we did a digital long read, and there was no print research report associated with it. It was purely a digital output. And again, the engagement with that's been very good. When we've talked to partners, we've been supporting them again to do more digital content, more blogs, to think about photo essays online. Some organisations are preparing photo books. So they will be print-based, but they'll be disseminated online. And then to create posters as well. So creative content which they'll disseminate online. So I mean, lots of changes, and it's been a huge learning curve.
Yeah, I can only agree with you there. A lot of us over the last few months have been trying to think very innovatively about how to, especially what you said there, interact with people. Where a lot of us are really used to traveling to countries across Sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general, and really engage with people on a sort of face-to-face basis, and it has been quite a struggle. But also at the same time, we have had a few successes, I think. As you said, you know, you're seeing a lot more engagement, etc., with digital content. Maybe if you could reflect on some of the maybe top 3 or key struggles that you can sort of reflect on, and then some of the successes that you've really had through this shift.
Yeah, sure. No, I think those are really, you know, you've picked out the key things. I think the really big challenge for us, and we're always conscious of it, is that we want to, through our digital engagement, we want to endorse our values of collaboration, participation, making sure that both women and men can participate, that all voices are heard, and at all levels. So not just at, say, government level, but also at community level. So for instance, in terms of social media, I mean, I read a report recently which said that across the Africa region, there's fewer than 2 in 5 of social media users are women. So how do we make sure that, you know, when we disseminate research, much of it which may have particular relevance to a woman's situation, that they're seeing it? You know, so sometimes a social media campaign isn't enough. You have to sort of have a sort of range of tactics to communicate the same piece of research, so to make sure that it reaches the right people. And that content has also got to be fully accessible digitally. So we may need transcripts, we may need subtitles. We also know that if people are working at home, they may not have Wi-Fi, or they may have poor internet connection, poor bandwidth, and so on. So all those considerations we're trying to bear in mind when we produce content, not producing, you know, large complex files, but really sort of compressing them and making them as simple as possible. But then I think the second thing I'd say is it's thinking about strategic communications. It's not just a broadcast function. You know, it's very important for us that we not only just sort of disseminate research, but that we also engage with research users. And that means being able to listen to them, setting up situations where we can listen to research users or listen to people who have something they want to contribute to the research, where we can take on board their ideas and truly engage with them, and not just sort of send something out and that's it. So the broadcast versus engagement dilemma is really important. And I think any good comms strategy needs both of those elements. And I'd say the final struggle it's not a struggle, it's a challenge. I mean, it's been, as I said, a huge learning curve for us. You know, we've had to think about how we can produce our podcast from home, basically, but still make it sound professional and accessible. We've had to build our skills in the team. There's been more work, you know, more content coming through. So it's been a really busy time. So those are the challenges, but there have been successes too, if you want me to mention those.
Yes, please. We're always more keen on having the success
Yeah,
highlighted.
exactly. Well, I mean, I think the thing to say is that, as I said, we've held a lot of webinars, a lot of virtual meetings. We've done more in the past 4 months than we did the whole of last year. but the registration and attendance has been really, really good. It's about 5 times more than we've had in the past, both for people who register and then those who turn up as well. We've had greater, wider geographic participation. Our speakers, more of our speakers have come from outside the UK, and more than half of our attendees have come from outside the UK. So we are reaching wider audiences, which is really good. In terms of the COVID content I mentioned, that's done incredibly well. We've had around 60,000 views of that content since late February, about 40 pieces of content. So that's way above what our average would normally be. And that's and the content itself, you know, has come from grassroots people, as I said, as well as being high-level analysis. So that's very gratifying. And we've also beginning to work out, we have an annual event called Community-Based Adaptation Conference, which has always been in person. You know, everyone meets for about 4 days. We've now managed to establish that on a platform online, and that's going to be held in late September. And we hope that we've created the same kind of feel as we would have had in person. So there'll be breakout groups, there'll be moments when people can socialize, there'll be presentations and discussions and so on. It's taken a huge amount of work, but I think that's really moved us forward. And I think we're quite pleased with the way that's been received, and people are beginning to register for attendance and so on. So lots more work, but you know, there's really good results coming out of it.
Fantastic, fantastic. It's all sounding great. Maybe now to go over to Karen. I'm sure as Rosalind was speaking, I think we're all sort of nodding and sharing similar experiences over the last few months. Maybe if I can ask you to reflect on what examples you can share for effective communication and collaboration between yourselves and national and local governments currently. How is this happening in the Western Cape government, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities on the ground?
So yes, thank you very much. And I think probably the most spoken words for 2020 will be, can you hear me? So yes, you know, we've got a completely different world. The disruption from our side, I think we're choosing to see it as a good disruption. Particularly if you look at it from a mitigation perspective, we've shown without doing much at all, in fact by staying home, that we can make a major impact. And the sorts of discussions that we've been having, I mean, we started our climate change work way back, so 2007. By 2014 we had a signed off cabinet strategy, but really it's been quite hard because in most Southern African countries, in fact in most developing countries, you've got so many issues to deal with. And in South Africa, we have huge inequalities. So it's very, very hard for climate change, which for a lot of politicians is a fairly nebulous concept, for them to be putting that on the agenda when housing and public health and education are all crying out for attention. So for us, it has been a bit of a challenge. And our document we always saw as a living document. So we worked very closely with our stakeholders all the way from the development stages. And I think that stood us in very, very good stead now. During the disruption, we've got relationships that we can actually go back to in terms of our stakeholders and in terms of our national colleagues and our municipal colleagues. So certainly we used to fly to Pretoria, which is our governance and administrative head center, to go and meet with our national colleagues on a quarterly basis, and we're now able to do that online. Ironically, we'd actually been asking for it to shift online for years. because we thought that this was a much better way of doing it, because we really don't want all those carbon kilometers on our footprints. But actually, just overnight, it literally was something that was switched on in people's heads, that actually this was fine. We could cope with this. We could figure it out. We could find the buttons and we could make a plan. And I think the technology has adapted very, very quickly. I mean, we work across a lot of the different platforms, and we've seen them getting more and more closer to each other. So somebody said, oh, that blue hand is a really good idea. Suddenly all the platforms have it, which is amazing, because it means that you can actually interact with your stakeholders. Chairing a meeting literally over the last few weeks has become just slightly easier than it was at the beginning of lockdown, because of the fact that people are going, well, what do our users need? And I think from our side, it's also been that question. What do our users need? And for us as a subnational government, our users are normally both the municipalities and then our public. And for our municipalities, they have been in crisis. There's no doubt about it. And something that I think was really, really good for us to do is to look at the existing platforms that were in existence pre-COVID. So we had a stakeholder forum for climate change. We used to meet physically. We had working groups that we would meet between the provincial departments. We're doing those virtually as well now. But the difference really has been being able to open up that spaces to new people. So why don't you join us on this platform? Come and listen. It doesn't now require you to drive anywhere or to fly anywhere to participate. And that's been a real eye-opener for a lot of people. And we've also been able to engage with our younger staff and say, well, look at all these webinars, that these are learning opportunities for you that you need to take up. They're free. We don't have to get you to Spain or to New York or wherever. We don't have to incur the cost or the flight carbon footprint to actually be able to expose you to the most recent conversations. So, I mean, for us, one of the highlights of our climate change work over the last few years has actually been our agricultural sector and the development of their planning, which is called Smart Agri. And the thing that was different about that, and where it's really, really paid off now during COVID, is that our Department of Agriculture worked very closely with us to actually identify geographic area-based responses, as well as crop-based responses. So we went down to commodity level. So what do our potato farmers need? What do our wheat farmers need? Who's getting irrigation? Who isn't? And what do they need? What messaging are they looking for? So not what do we have, but what do our user groups need? The people who have to make day-to-day decisions, what do they need from us as the climate change team to be able to respond to the challenges that they see? And I think for us, again, another good disruption, as disruptive as it was the drought that we went through between 2015 and 2018. In some parts of our province, we are still in drought in our central region. But what it did for us, I think that, and COVID following very shortly after that, was it has put into stark relief food security issues and our ecological infrastructure and how those play a role in our resilience. So for us, the conversation really is starting to thread through an unfortunate series of disasters. But for us, we're taking the attitude of let's not waste a good disaster. Let's make sure that we actually pick up on the poignant issues of what didn't work. Why did our system fail? Why is irrigation farming a real problem? Now, we know the answers as researchers, as scientists, we know what the answer is, but we haven't necessarily had those conversations until that external pressure is there. So for us, we've been using the disaster management mechanisms very closely, especially through our joint operational committees, to actually put everybody in the room. So you've got all the sectors represented, and you start having real conversations about how you're going to recover, not back to where you were, but back to a position where you're much more resilient. And what on earth does that look like? So I think the discussions that we've been having during COVID have been a lot more realistic and a lot more practical. And we've been having those discussions across multiple platforms, yes, virtual, But I think being at the table is a really critical point. I've got a colleague of mine who says, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And for us, being at the table and making sure that we're on the agenda, making sure that we mention climate change whilst we're talking about our recovery plans, means that we're actually starting to change the nature of the conversation. So in terms of our municipalities, let's recognize that they're struggling with COVID. But what is making it worse? And how are we pushing that conversation to talk about poverty, insecurity, urban structures and infrastructure in a way that's meaningful, both for this disaster, where everybody's focus is, but also for future disasters that we unfortunately know will be coming.
Thanks, Karen. I mean, those are some really excellent points. And I think, you know, when you look at the crisis as an opportunity, you can also see how by engaging virtually, you then are able to open your door to a number of different participants and attendees to webinars, etc., but also to workshops. There's a famous African proverb that says, wait, let me just get it here. Communication does not work when two people speak at the same time, which is very interesting. And I think, you know, one thing that some of these virtual platforms are showing us, that you can actually allow for different people to come in at different times. And maybe to ask you just on reflection with that, if you have any key pointers for people in terms of how to ensure that there is active engagement from all of those that you have in the room, in the virtual room. It would be really helpful to our listeners to hear some of those pointers.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that for me has shaken loose in terms of COVID and what it's done for us is we're having the data conversation in a very different way. So those of you who've ever worked in government or worked for parastatals, you will know that data for some reason is something to be locked away in a vault and preferably not shared with anybody. For some reason, government agencies really have an allergic reaction when you ask them for their information. I think you are, you know, they're scared that you're going to show that they're not doing their jobs properly or something like that. But actually being able to really understand and unpack what information we do have, what's missing, and what we can model in between has been a really good conversation starter for us. And it's introduced a whole lot of new players into the climate change discussion for us, but also into the disaster management discussion. Because the very first thing we asked from our social development team was, where are the vulnerable people? Who do we need to be watching out for? How do we help them? Who needs to help them? And what kind of facilities do we need to set up to do that? And believe it or not, it was one of the first times that we had a multidisciplinary team mapping socioeconomic vulnerability in that way. Which for us is kind of a no-brainer. Of course, we should know where people are and what people might be suffering. If we have a flood whilst we're having lockdown, obviously people are in their homes. So we're going to preempt that because we need to make sure that they're safe before we have the crisis. So, you know, just engaging past the silos has been really important for me. And it's been fantastic. I think when people are completely out of their comfort zone, they're willing to ask questions. They're willing to accept questions from other people, questioning what they've done and how they've done it, because it's no longer about whether or not you did your job. This thing is so much bigger than everybody, and it gives you this really wonderful opportunity to actually crack open the space of going, well, none of us could have foreseen this, so let's work out the agreement together. Let's actually figure out a way of responding together. And we saw that with the drought as well. I think when we were closest to what the media started calling day zero, which was essentially the day in which the city of Cape Town would have had to turn off its reticulation system for water and require its citizens to physically go and collect water. That was a moment, I think, where we had the most innovative, creative, engaged conversations that we've ever had. Because people had stopped protecting their mandates They'd stopped protecting their budgets and their egos, and they genuinely started communicating. They genuinely opened up to each other in a situation where if you didn't open up, basically that's when you were going to be shown to not be doing your job. As long as you were trying, nobody could really point you out and say that you're a bad person. So at some stages, and I mean during this COVID crisis as well, we're not through it yet, but fortunately the Western Cape has over its peak. We hope that there won't be a second peak, but what we started using was those additional platforms that were already in existence. So another thing that we do a lot in government is that we love setting up structures, and then they last well beyond their point of meaningful engagement. Sometimes they just meet because you said somewhere that you'd meet every quarter, not because you have a meaningful role to play. And what we've been able to do is actually maneuver some of those structures to be structures that actually support COVID. So take over the terms of reference of the agendas of the new platform that's already there, make it new, refresh it, introduce new people into that space, but actually keep the municipal manager on board, keep your disaster manager on board, and introduce new energy. So I'm hoping that what we will take away from this is that those structures will remain invigorated, and that those people who've become involved now during the crisis will stay there and be able to add value, because this is where we're starting to open up the discussions about resilient infrastructure and whether or not we're actually prepared for the next disaster. So whilst we have people in a state of perturbation, we're actually able to take their grip from business as usual and actually get them to see that perhaps change is not a bad thing. Perhaps it's exactly what we need to do. And it's a lot more doable than they used to think of it, because look what we've just survived. So it's quite important. It's almost like when you're baking, you want to do certain things while the cookies are still hot. It's very much like that when you're trying to communicate with people. Make sure, for some reason, people have a very short memory. In 2 years' time, when the vaccine is out and everybody is feeling comfortable, you will want to go back to usual. You will want to go back to your safety zone. So we need to make sure that our communications are pushing people hard enough that the business as usual has shifted long before we get too cold and too unwilling to move again. Because we don't have to go through another crisis of this scale to actually know we need to shift.
Absolutely. And so much of what we'll take away will, as you say, provide some innovative new structures and new ways of thinking as we go forward. Maybe to reflect, Rosalind, with what you were also saying, which practices will you keep in terms of the way that you're communicating or doing research in the future?
Yes, I mean, I think that point about sticking with change is an important one. I mean, our researchers, IID researchers in the past have spent a lot of time traveling. And I've heard some colleagues saying they'll never take a long distance flight again for a 2-day meeting. But on the other hand, some of our research is in places where there's nothing that will replace face-to-face meetings, building trust with groups of people, and so on. And I think, although of course that you can build trust digitally, virtually, it's much easier to do it in person. So I think things like travel related to research will reduce, but there will always be a place for meetings as well. But and likewise, we'll definitely continue to produce and find ways to create different kinds of accessible digital content. But bearing in mind our range of audiences, again, we may always have some need for print content. But, you know, we will be nimble where we can and change where we can, but recognizing that the overarching issue for us is that we don't exclude people, that everyone has access to the information that can help them transform their situation. We will develop our workshop style virtual meetings. You know, there's lots more to learn there. We're not necessarily ahead of the game on that. There are other organisations which have been doing that for some time. So IID recognises it's got a lot to learn. And in fact, a colleague of mine is focusing for 3 months on a specific project, looking at how can IID adapt digitally, what new skills are needed, what new software is needed, hardware and so on, how we can change the way we work so that we can be accessible in line with our values, but at the same time take this opportunity to reduce travel, to reduce our carbon emissions and so on. Although, of course, digital technology has its own carbon emissions. We mustn't forget that. And I think that actually hasn't been taken on board enough by a lot of people. We will, I think, probably, we want to listen to find out more from partners what works for them. You know, WhatsApp's a very successful tool that a lot of partners are using to do surveys, to talk to their networks. We'll do more mobile-based surveys because we know more of our audiences are using mobiles to look at our content. We'll work with partners to do more blogs, photo essays, and so on. You know, we need to look at what works, listen to them, and help support them to develop that, learn from them about what they're doing, and then we can do that as well. So I think there's going to be lots of changes, lots of new skills. For someone like me who isn't a digital native, that's quite not alarming. I wouldn't say alarming, but I'm not ahead of the game compared with some of my younger colleagues. But you know, it's exciting. It's good to be learning new stuff. That's why I'm in the job. I don't want to feel I've got nothing to learn. So I think that will be multiplied across the organisation with that underlying motivation that whatever we do, we try to be as inclusive as possible for all the groups, the men, the women that we're working with, people with disabilities and so on. So I think that's a major factor that will inform what we do in the future. Absolutely
great. Yeah, I think a lot of us sort of techie people are becoming very savvy.
I'm learning the language anyway.
Exactly. Thanks, Rosalind. So maybe from Karen, I can ask you to maybe in 3 minutes reflect on, or please elaborate on the department's focus on the narrative that climate change is a threat multiplier. I think it would be interesting to reflect on how you're going about this within your department. What are some of the struggles and some of the successes that you're finding with this framing?
So I think, you know, we've done quite a bit of work pre-COVID in terms of it being a threat multiplier, in terms of the risk to the economy, and basically trying to guide decision makers on what are good decisions. And COVID for us has very much exposed the inequality in our society. And I think it's stark. I mean, seeing lines of children waiting for a single meal for the day is heartbreaking. But what has really come through as well is that those people who have more, are sharing. There's a tremendous amount of kindness and awareness that suddenly emerged from this very stark crisis of socioeconomic vulnerability that we've seen. So just as a second crisis to the health crisis, we are encouraging the tracking of costs, because what we've been finding is that generally disaster response costs are limited to the actual emergency vehicles that you sent out and whatever disaster funds you allocated, full stop. So the cost that civic society is picking up, certainly in terms of COVID for us, it's around feeding and the health cost, the long-term indicators that we're seeing of malnutrition, etc. So the complex nature of any disaster is something that we're not costing properly. And when we don't cost it, we don't value it. So when we start arguing that climate change is going to multiply everything that we're seeing now by 100 or more, you know, pick your number depending on your model, it's really hard for people to grasp. And I think there's been a lot of literature as well about how people switch off from the negativity because they start reading documents about what 1.5 degree increase looks like, and it's horrifying, it's terrifying. So you focus rather on things that are a little closer, a little easier, as hard as they might be. We're basically facing hunger, we're facing inequality, we're facing unemployment, we're facing education issues, and it's really, really hard for us to simply throw climate change into that mix and expect it to get a lot of attention. So what we've started doing is really trying to get people to see climate change as a lens through which you look at those other problems. So that when you are looking at your recovery plan, and this has very much been our focus at the moment, let's influence our economic recovery plan because we want it to be a more resilient economy because we need people to be employed. They need to be employed in appropriate ways so that we're not going back to coal-based energy, etc. We need to be making those key decisions now while it's hard so that we actually do have better transport systems and better infrastructure to support us in future. So we're mapping the vulnerabilities. We're trying to point out very distinct urban functionality problems, and our planners are working very closely with us for that. We're also wanting to articulate who are the winners and who are the losers. So particularly talking about gender mainstreaming, our disabled communities, etc. Actually understanding that it's not the community as one group, but that within that community there are individual sensitivities and vulnerabilities that we need to see. Because some of our decisions impact children very differently to the way it impacts a teenager or an adult. And we need to understand that in order to make that resilient shift. So I think the issues for us are not, we don't suffer them alone. We've got a lot of problem with our vertical alignment of our policies and strategies. And generally, whilst we may say the right things and pay lip service in the right way, actually getting fundamental systemic change is a real problem. And I think we all know that, we all experience that. But I think what gives me a heart really is having seen the caring and the volunteering that's come out of this crisis for us here in our region. It reminds me of Daniela Meadows, and there's a particular quote from her that I absolutely adore. And she says, "There is too much bad news to justify complacency. There is too much good news to justify despair." And for me, part of our communication strategy moving forward and getting people to own that climate change is a threat multiplier is about making sure we also tell the good news stories, about making sure that things that can make it better are understood, because otherwise people turn away because it's too hard and it's too frightening. So don't just tell people what they can't do, find out where they are and help them start with whatever they can to make a difference, to take that first step. And I think that's where our communications focus is trying to drive people to. So don't go for the end picture. We get that, you know, being carbon neutral is big and frightening. We're not quite sure how to get there. Let's take the first step and then the next and then the next. And what are those benefits coming from those steps that we're getting? Let's make sure that people understand the good side of a just transition.
Exactly. Thanks, Karen. And, you know, we're all in this together. So it's a true reflection for the climate change issue too. Thanks. So now I would like to move further afield and introduce our next speaker, Mr. Washington, who is the Director for Climate Change Management at the Department in the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality. He has held this position for 5 years, and Washington is responsible for the management of climate change implementation in the country. Prior to this position, he worked for the Meteorological Services Department before joining the University of Zimbabwe as a lecturer in the Geography and Environmental Science Department. Mr. Zakata has also worked for UNDP as a National Program Coordinator for climate change. This is a pre-recorded contribution, but we are also happy to let the audience know that Mr. Washington Zakata is also joining us live, so he will also be able to field some questions during the Q&A. Thanks.
Great. So, Mr. Zakata, what examples can you share with us for effective communication and collaboration between national and local governments that have worked, especially as you establish national adaptation processes such as the district working groups and the technical consultancy team, and you continue to work on the NDC implementation? So if you can just elaborate on some of the challenges and opportunities and success stories, and as well as the processes and the integration, the vertical integration between national and local governments. Thank you. Go for it.
Thank you very much. In looking at the issues of effective communication and collaboration at national and local government level, our model, which we designed, which we developed in the country first, was to put the various stratas whom we would want to target. That is the individual, institutional, as well as the systemic level. That once they are in a good picture of what you want to carry out, what you want to do, then automatically they would open the floodgates, the roads, the routes for implementation of any activity in the country, especially with respect to climate change. So important at first was awareness at cabinet level, which we had to do through a cabinet memo that we wrote to be presented by our minister at the cabinet. That would unlock, I would say, our ways, our pathways to the provinces, to meet with the various ministers, various permanent secretaries in the respective ministries. And we also had meetings with the permanent secretary and permanent secretaries, as well as the members of parliament. That's number one. This is just to unlock our pathway to the provinces so that there are no hurdles as we implement the NAP process itself. So when the process began, we had to formulate a team that would carry out this activity to drive through the NAP process. And this team was strategically combining of the Climate Change Management Department, local government, as well as other members of the parliament itself, as we started driving the awareness raising and the consultations with provincial leadership, as well as provincial development committees. Local government team members were, of course, already familiar with their provinces, and the process became much, much simpler for establishment of the working groups. So we have seen it very important, very prudent to ensure that we have the members of the local government in our various structures, various committees, like the Department of Civil Protection, which is one unit responsible for disaster risk management, where climate change management plays a very critical role. We work together full-time on this committee. So members also of the local government already participate in the nationally determined contribution committees. They are also represented in the National Technical Committee, as well as the subcommittees that look at the various sectors separately. So we are already working together in various subcommittees. And in these subcommittees and national committees related to climate change, already the climate change agenda is imparted, and also knowledge about climate change is also imparted to the participants, including those in the local government. Cannot conduct a NAP process without full engagement of the NAP process, of the local government staff members. Secondly, we also notice that as we impart knowledge to these technical level participants from local government, that is also inclusive of the urban settings, urban local authorities, among others, it is also very critical to engage a top-down approach and it works very well, is our minister who is responsible for climate change. First, he has to understand very well the climate change agenda, what is happening at global level, what is happening internally, where do we want to take climate change. Then we have managed to accomplish this. And then the minister becomes our conduit for us to meet with provincial ministers. And he is the one whom we task with sensitizing the provincial ministers first, so that the provincial ministers give also directives downwards. By this time, by the time we started approaching the technocrats at provincial levels, they were already informed, they were already instructed, they already knew even the gravity of this whole climate change issue itself. And what is critical is when we were working towards coming up with these working groups at district level, first of all, we have to have the buy-in from the province. But the province itself is constituted of districts, making the steps to set up these systems at district level much simpler, because already we would have thrashed out, talked, brainstormed on climate change at provincial level. Here in Zimbabwe, under the constitution of Zimbabwe, we now have a devolution of powers from the central government to the provinces, so that the provinces have much more say on what they are making, what they are producing, how they are mobilizing resources towards the national cause at provincial level, and also retain some perhaps amount of money within their provinces. So this process of devolution is just started. The provinces have been given a jump start of in terms of resources to start this process. In doing so, we took advantage of a national process that had already started to say, now, as you devolve, you need to ensure that climate change is mainstreamed into your development planning. And we came up with examples, even examples stretching to bridges themselves, which had been designed, some of them in the 70s, before climate change became topical. And in some cases, the rivers have diverted their routes. And so we say, before you do anything, you need, first of all, to climate-proof your designs, for example. And before you settle people, we have done a few pilot projects on digital elevation models to ascertain the vulnerability of settlements with respect to potential flooding. We had an example of one of the biggest dams, actually it's the biggest inland dam in Zimbabwe, which was constructed with a design from far back in the 80s or in the 70s. Just recently, in the past 5 years, when it was about to be commissioned, there was a serious flood, and the water was 4 meters above the dam itself, meaning to say it was threatening to sweep the dam wall, and they would have lost millions and millions of dollars. So commissioning had to stop, and we had to call another company to come and retrofit the dam wall itself, now using the recent statistics with respect to climate change. So these are some of the examples which we would take to the provinces to ensure that they really see how climate change could impact on their day-to-day living, on their planning itself, and how effective planning would reduce costs in future. So we have managed to get into the provinces. This was our first stage. Getting in, utilizing also what the government is already doing on devolution of powers to the provinces, which is one very critical example of our success stories to date. Although we haven't finished the development of the national adaptation process or working on the national adaptation process, we are now moving now from the provinces to the district level now. But already we've been discussing with the critical or the key members of the districts at provincial level, since they constitute the provincial development committees. However, we have a bit of challenges that we have encountered also, because wherever this issue of climate change is being articulated, there are issues which require urgent attention. Some of these have been associated with staff turnover or changes in staff attending the committee meetings, making it a must that you have to start afresh all over again in the event that one may not have been in the previous meeting. So this has been observed in some areas, which gives us maybe a lesson that we need to put more stakeholders into this whole exercise, train more, capacitate more of these members of the committees at provincial, even national, as well as district levels. And also the reorganization of the government ministries in the past 3 years, again, has been an issue that continued really to give pressure on the climate change management department to start all over again. With the next, as the ministries reorganized, some departments shifted from one ministry to the other. With another department now, ministry split, always there are issues that we have to handle, that we have to deal with. And so it has been one of the challenges that we faced. But of course, there are a bit of opportunities that go along with the whole exercise. The established working groups, of course, will be used to mainstream climate change in the various sectors, in areas within their jurisdiction. We notice that climate change is now being discussed at another level. We even notice I would say, capacitation of the members of parliament itself is assisting a lot in when the district development committees, the provincial development committees are starting to discuss these issues of climate change. And this is a positive on our side. I think that's what I can say on this response to your question.
Thank you so much. So we want to ask you, why do you think communication is so very important, and what success or unsuccessful stories do you have of how national has communicated with local level?
Yes, communication is very, very critical. Information itself, information is power, is security, and is knowledge. And once you do not have information, it means you do not have these three components. So once you are not informed, then automatically it means that you cannot, in some cases, act appropriately. So information is one of the key elements to initiate an action. So we look at the education, training, awareness component, even within our department, is one of the major components that is required to ensure that it opens up the minds of the people for them to take in climate change. Because before, we were discussing issues to do with climate change in general. But now when we go down to the levels of the impacts, even on our day-to-day activities, and also on our energy demand and the energy supply, we have living examples here in Zimbabwe, where we have almost half of the energy production is through hydropower generation, and the dam that produces that electricity had gone below the levels of energy supply. So the country was subjected to load shedding for up to 18 hours per day, for almost 4 months. And the rest of the energy was now being drawn from the thermal power generation. And we had to go out and to ensure that people know that we are now using thermal power generation, but as we use it, we should remember that discussions at global level are talking about phasing out of this because of the reasons of high emissions of carbon dioxide. and how it affects the people, agriculture, sector by sector. And already the various ministries are now talking about this issue of how they could use less of even firewood itself, coal itself for drying the crops, and also how we could expand the usage of renewable energy, which is now becoming very, very topical. Solar, we've seen now the cropping up of solar solar power stations, mini hydropower stations coming on board, some proposals for conversion of waste to energy, among others. All this is coming out of information, and also in ensuring that everybody comes to terms with the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement is there to stay, and it's very clear on the roles and responsibilities of each and every country to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, and also it's to our benefits as we drive towards a climate resilient and low carbon economy.
Thanks. That was our intervention from Mr. Washington Zakata, again with us for joining live for the webinar. And we will field some questions to him at the end during our Q&A session. For our next intervention, we have recorded a conversation that occurred between ICLEI Africa and Nakuru County in Kenya. The discussion centers on the key lessons of communication from both the 100% RE, so that's the 100% renewable energy, and the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa initiative. The 100% RE project aims to support local governments with developing community-wide 100% renewable energy strategy and action plans, increase local awareness, and develop bankable projects, and also to explore access to finance for implementation. Just to give you some context there on that project. Engineer Festus Ngenu is the CECM for Water, Environment, Energy and Natural Resources in the County Government of Nakuru, and has over 12 years of experience in the public and private sector at senior management level. He is also the chairman of the Council of Governors Committee on Water, Forestry and Mining, and responsibilities in this role include advising 47 counties within Kenya on issues relating to water, sanitation, forestry, mining, and climate change. Engineer Festus is also responsible for the implementation of county and national legislation within the county and managing and coordinating the functions of the Ministry of Water, Environment, Energy and Natural Resources. A great conversation that was had. The pre-recording, there was a slight connection error there were slight connectivity issues, excuse me, when this was recorded. But so we do apologize for this, although it didn't affect the overall content.
If you could share some examples for effective communication and collaboration between national and local governments that have worked as you co-produced or did a number of activities within the ICLEI projects, or the projects ICLEI is involved in, including COMSA, as well as the 100% RE.
Great, thanks, Naji. I think on the onset is to say that the collaboration between the national and the county government will only work when there is communication. The responsibility or effective communication is key. You can't assume that whatever you say is whether the partner will be able to understand. And particularly of our engagement so far with ICLEI on the 100% RE programming and COMSA, I would want to emphasize and say that the two levels of government, especially with our context in Kenya, where we have the national government and the county government. Of course, national government is usually responsible for policy strategy making. But of course, when it comes to county government, we mainstream the communication for whether it's in form of documentation and the implementation of matrices of various programs that comes on place. And I would say, especially for the 100% RE, you remember that while energy function is a shared national government being responsible for the bigger part of it, and of course county government responsible for the renewable part of the energy. While this program is fully entrenched and in situ with the various counties, and of course I'm mentioning Nakuru, Kisumu, and of course Mombasa for this particular conversation, we have had the Ministry of Energy being fully involved because of the regulatory framework. So for anything we produce, whether it's renewable or grid power, and of course green energy for that matter, the ministry must get involved. So we've been having that collaborative framework, and for our success even on the 100% RE, from where I see so far so good, we've been having those engagements. And in fact, to mention again on the issue of effective communication, apart from even ICLEI, and I would want to put this at this juncture, that I think ICLEI came to Nakuru, for example, at the right time, because quite a number of other partners, which you must be aware about, would want also to engage the county government on matters renewable energy for that matter. So what we've been able to do is to communicate also personally, effectively, and say, for anyone who wants to really have this conversation with us, you must be able to just co-create and co-sing with the already existing programs or structures that we have established with ICLEI program. Because I think, as I mentioned, the opportunity that this has presented to us is so enormous. We can comfortably say, and Naji on this particular, and I need to mention this, that we are very focused, we are very well appraised, we know what we need to do now, even on the various partners with the ICLEI coming up, because you've shaped our thoughts in such a way that it is not only ICLEI that are interested in this renewable energy, but also other partners are in. So any other partner, and I will give you an example, and you will see that as we progress even in this in our program in Nakuru, that USAID under the Kenya Investment Program wanted to look at also renewable energy, especially on solar PVs, generation of energy in Nakuru. And one of the key things, and I told them, is that we cannot establish new structures or new conversations on energy, especially when we have already mapped out the stakeholders and the can be effective, but especially for me and my grace with our PC and of course my chief officer Giogora, is that you come on board through the ICLEI program and support our agenda, and that is how we are progressing. So I'll say that it is about, it makes our work easier when we just give out and communicate and let the other person understand where we are coming. And one of the key things I want to appreciate is that we know where we are, we know what you are doing, we know where we are going. So anyone else who wants to come on board will have to follow that path, and it will be successful. Same thing with the COMSA, the SICA program, sustainable energy, and of course climate change mainstreaming, same story. So I think I would want to reflect on those portfolios. And of course, again, I think you've been also involved in COVID response even at this particular time. I wouldn't want to fail to mention that our coordination, especially from the climate change perspective, and also on WASH, and also on from the health perspective, has been so much clearer, especially with the structures that are in situ, which we've been able to establish within the program. So I would mention that, Naji.
Thank you very much for that feedback. And just to mention that, and I also like that you also reflected that there is constant communication, and that's very important.
Yes.
And as ICLEI, what we've also working with GIZ as well, what we've also found really encouraging is working with the Nakuru County. It's been the exceptional leadership I mean, you are very well versed with everything that's going on. You're very dedicated.
Yeah.
You ask questions. I mean, you even challenge the projects as they are.
Yes. Yeah.
And that ensures that we really give the best in terms of the support that we provided to the county. And even with getting other stakeholders involved, when they know that the CEC is aware of what is happening, that goes a long way. So you also play a very, very important role, and you've really become an example that we use when engaging with other local governments in terms of the importance of leadership. So we really appreciate that.
I think it's critical maybe to add on that, and appreciated your compliments on the same. Where I sit is you need to look at the entire perspective in all assembly. Look from the end-to-end business of the game. You don't just look at we want to do renewable 100%. And there are so many other players on board, and therefore what I tend to do is to look at it from that concept of what is the focus of the county. Is it even in line with the manifesto of the ESEX and the governor, for example? Is it in line with our strategy? I think that's where I come from, and it has been so much effective. And as I mentioned, donor coordination, constant communication, forecast, even the questions we ask that we know might not be answered, we see how it can be answered through the program. So in fact, one of the critical ones, our success, Nigeria, and we appreciate this program, is the fact that we are now all partners that would want to do anything on energy. We have a structure. So you come on board, we don't start parallel. So there's no way we will have parallel program running on energy with Nigeria weekly. Then we have USAID here, we have at some point some partner was not, and for me this is how I focus on it. If you are not interested in co-creation, in working together as partnership and focus on the same thing, then you are not of the interest of the county government of Nakuru, and that's where we come. And it's been very, very effective and successful. And of course, you will see our structure. We try to. It is a bottom-up approach. While we provide strategy on the upper side, even as I communicate downwards to my team leaders and even to the PC who happens to be Grace, and even the Grace with her team, we try to make sure that she understands what's happening. In fact, even before this program, I called Grace to confirm, so what will be the focus of this pre-recorded, and she understands the program herself, even at a level which is slightly lower than where I am. That means then the information flow is in sync within the ministry. If I am not there today, Naji, I can tell you that the program will continue. That one I can tell you. It is not anchored on me. It is not anchored on Kisio Kyokora. It is not even anchored on Grace. It is anchored under the ministry, our department. So there will be a number of players that will be able to progress with their program. Yeah.
So just as the last question, and I know you've responded to this somewhat, I just wanted to know if there are any practices or strategies that you can say should be in place or can be used to ensure good collaboration and communication across projects between different levels of government. So when it comes to communication, what works? What are practices that can be used to ensure effective communication and successful collaboration?
Thank you. I would look at it this way, that the framework within the particular ministry and whether policy, strategy, the vision for the department should be communicated effectively. So while that is there, that should not be, as I mentioned, should not be within the leader alone, should be able to be communicated. So the success in terms of collaboration is understanding why did we engage first of all in signing up for the program. I think that is part of the critical objectives that we would want to achieve as a county or as a department. And therefore, then even as you sign up for the program, they were critical objectives. What is in it for us? What is in it even for the best practices or what I can call it? No, you say ICLEI is, it is about networking of local governments or county governments, sharing of experiences. What is it that we were lacking, for example, in Nakuru, so that we signed up for the program? And I think what came out very strongly was that we are looking at being a green city, right? Green in terms of energy, green in terms of green in terms of environment, green in terms of housing programs. Of course, all of these things comes under the SECAP, or that's the Sustainable Energy Programming and the Climate Change Action Plans. So I think that understanding of the overall or the big vision and the overall goal as a leader should be able to be transmitted to the lower cadre. When that one happens, then you should be able now to have the programs effectively disseminated. The good progress so far is as a result of dedicated staff. I think that's one of the key things I need to mention. And you, of course, you appoint a staff as a leader, and you give her or him the responsibility, the support, the free will to make decisions. And of course, I have successfully even engaged in so many of other programs with our POC, with a point of contact place, without even my involvement personally, or even my chief officer Kyokora. That means, therefore, we get briefs, and that's another. The communication feedback from press is effective. That I don't need to call Nachi, for example, to ask her, so what did you discuss? It is my team or teams that are participating in the program that are able to communicate back effectively. So that has been the success. So even as we transform this program, and I mentioned this in our conversation last week or the other week, Naji, that even as Kisumu participates in the deep dive, and as Nakuru lands and Mombasa lands from the Kisumu program, we will be asking and questions that we want to be part of. We want at the end of the day to be like we were also in deep dive, even though the program we are learning from the other end. So it is so critical. So even for Kisumu, then they need to really be shaped up so that we can be able to clearly appreciate how the program goes. And of course, at the end of the day, the outputs, when you say ICLEI, we are in ICLEI, we are on this networking program, what have we achieved so far? And I can tell you one is, and we are looking at on the climate change perspective, that even on the collaborators, even as we look at the climate change action plans, and of course the energy action plan, which is those are the framework tools, getting increasingly participation from the various sector players, because they have understood that there is a coordinating unit under ICLEI. Remember when we had a program in Nakuru and you saw the various partners asking what is in it or what is my role? Framework, structures, focus leadership, and of course the dedicated staff will make the program a success. And I've seen that.
Thank you for that intervention there, again coming from Engineer Festus from Nakuru County in Kenya. I would like to now hand over to our senior manager, Dr. Megan Spires, who will provide some reflections on the case studies that we have just heard.
Thanks, Tara, and just reflecting on the inputs from all four of the speakers, some really valuable insights, and I think us sitting here and in the ICLEI Africa team have really felt a resonance with what has been said by all of the speakers, and in particular its relation to the upcoming Congress that in fact Vanessa mentioned, the Local Climate Solutions for Africa Congress that will be held virtually from the 3rd to the 12th of November. And I think why it resonated so much with us is because we have decided to have 3 overarching themes underneath the overall Congress focus on climate finance. And each of the speakers spent some time reflecting on those overarching themes in relation to this webinar's focus on communications during COVID and during the climate crisis too. Rosalind, for instance, mentioned some really important points around gender, and gender is in fact an overarching theme for our LOCS 2020 Congress in November. What really struck me in terms of what she said was that we know that 2 out of 5 African women may not have access to social media, and so we really need to be diversifying our communication output and ensuring that it reaches those that are most vulnerable. And again, Corin also mentioned how COVID has highlighted the inequalities that the world faces, and so building back better and building back from this COVID-19 crisis with the climate change lens makes a lot of sense, and that links very much to another overarching theme of the LOCKSS 2020 Congress, which is on the green recovery or the COVID-19 recovery. And I also particularly liked the analogy that Karen used, referring to this limited period of time that we have when the cookies are warm. And there's been many academic articles and practitioner articles written about these windows of opportunity that we have, that unfortunately when going through a crisis, it doesn't create huge challenges, but there's also the opportunity to really relook at the way things are structured, and look at ways finance is mobilized and how can it be done in a greener, more sustainable and climate change friendly way. And then Washington and Engineer Festus spoke very much about the importance of multi-level governance, and that is also an overarching theme for LOCKSS for Africa 2020. And in fact, I really want to highlight the important role that Zimbabwe as a national government has played, really being a leader on the continent in terms of multi-level governance and devolution of powers to the tiers of government in which they're best held and the best housed. And Washington reflected on how this devolution has occurred to provincial and also to local governments in Zimbabwe, which is also one of the leaders on the continent in terms of the revision of their NDC, which charts their course in relation to climate change. And then I also particularly liked Engineer Festus's reflections on donor coordination. And I think, as Nachi said during her interview with Engineer Festus, we've been challenged by the take that has been the case in Kenya and particularly in Nakuru around ensuring that the donor work being done in that country and in those cities really meets the needs of the communities and of the cities themselves. And that is of vital importance. So I really just want to use this opportunity to encourage the attendees of this particular webinar and for your networks to please attend the virtual Congress from the 3rd to the 12th of November, our LOCKSS for Africa Congress, the details of which we can share with you post this webinar. There will be numerous subtracks underneath the theme of finance for change, and a space really for all participants to engage and find value in being part of that particular journey. And then my final input is to also say, if you are interested in hearing more in terms of how the Western Cape and Cape Town in particular, as Africa's first epicenter in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have put together with various partners a really important webinar on the 15th of September, where we will have high-level stakeholders who are really at the forefront of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in Cape Town and the Western Cape, from Premier Windy and others. So please do join us for that on the 15th of September. Tara, over to you for the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Megan. And also just to note, I realize we may go, well, we're very likely to go a bit over time, but we hope that you bear with us. I have just 3 questions, one for each of the speakers that we have still online. And the first one I'd like to pose to Washington comes from Marcel Zimmerman. How does the Zimbabwean government engage with communities to ensure their work is responsive to the community's needs?
Right. Thank you very much, Tara. Engagement with the communities, it's an ongoing process. What the government does is to work also in consultation with the non-governmental organizations that are also working within different communities across the country. Non-governmental organizations, they are very effective. We have them across the whole country, and we've got a forum which we have also established in collaboration with the non-governmental organization, like the climate change non-governmental working group on climate change. This is a consortium of NGOs who work across the whole country, who collect data on our behalf, and then they provide us with information on the gaps, constraints, and opportunities and needs of the communities. We've got also a ministry that is purely responsible for looking at the communities, like the Ministry of Local Government, the Ministry of Public Service, Labor, and Social Welfare. it is offices across the board, which are also in the various communities to be right there where the communities are. And apart from that, we also have a ministry of small and medium enterprises development, which is also in the communities. This is just to complement government efforts, apart from the various government arms that work in all the provinces, in all the districts, and collaborate in the consolidation and the collection of information across the various districts and provinces.
Thank you so much, Washington. That was very clear from our side, and great to have you join us live on the webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Tara.
Thanks. So now I'd like to hand over to Karen for a question, and I hope again that I've captured this correctly, from Paul Agbemenyas. I hope I've said that correctly. The question for Karen: what ways can resilience be included in your climate change communications?
Well, I think that's the big question, isn't it? Look, for us, I think the language has shifted a bit in our communications. So historically, we haven't necessarily used the word resilience. I think until 2015-16, when the drought really hit us, was really where we started changing our language and started looking at moving away from using the term sustainability, which for a lot of people, especially civic organizations, and when you're talking to communities, they're not sure what you mean by that. And I think there are an awful lot of government officials that don't know what it means either. Sort of what would sustainability look like if you fell over it in the street? So resilience and vulnerability, I think, are words that for most people are much stronger, they're much more tangible. So for us, it's very much around very practical things. So it was great to hear the other speakers as well talk about bridge designs, road work. So we're literally getting down to how our tar roads are put together and whether or not the bitumen is going to be able to cope with the heat that we're anticipating, the heat and the sudden cold, so the changes in temperature, where our human settlements are. We have a number of informal settlements and slums that we need to upgrade, some in situ, but some will have to be moved because where they are is actually in floodplains or in other forms where naturally the geography just doesn't allow us to service areas. So I think in our language and in our awareness, it's much more about trying to articulate to people the very real ways that climate change interacts with their daily lives and with the realities that they're seeing from one day to the next. And that's really how we talk about resilience these days. And it's something that we found quite a lot of benefit coming from the discussions with communities, especially now post-COVID or during COVID, is that discussion is a lot more visceral than it ever used to be. It's very close. People are on the breadline. We have more than 50%, certainly within the city of Cape Town, on the breadline. So this is a discussion. Resilience becomes a matter of life or death.
Yeah, exactly. Very powerful words there. Thanks, Karen. And now if I can move to Rosalind, just to ask you on to reflect maybe on a comment from Sifiwa Mudau, where he suggested that maybe including climate-related modules in all schools and universities would be a good idea in order to ensure that people act.
Yes, I mean, I think that's part of making it real, as Karen just said, you know, practical examples that people can, that resonate with people. And I think that's just one part of society where we can start talking about what the impacts and effects of climate change are going to be. Whatever the subject that you're studying, there will always be something which makes it relevant. But as I said I responded to one of the questions on the chat, I think that it's really important that we don't spread alarm, but people discuss these things in a way that makes them realize that they can be part of what needs to change, that they can be empowered, that their ideas, the ways that they know will work for their community or for their group of people, those will be taken on board so that they can play a really effective, active part in seeing changes happen. And if it's done in that way, where people feel ownership of the solutions and the responses, then I hope that that will mean there's less fear, there's less anxiety around what climate change is going to mean in the future. It is alarming. There are going to be significant changes, but we need to think and discuss it in a way that we can all see what our part is in what the change is going to be, so that you know, we feel empowered and powerful in doing that rather than helpless. So I think a communication strategy which enables that to happen is really essential.
Great, thanks so much, Rosin. Couldn't agree more. So since we are running just a few minutes over time, maybe then I would like to just thank our speakers for joining us today and really giving us so much food for thought. I had a message from our communications team that they actually had more than 2 pages of really meaty quotes and useful take-homes from this webinar in particular. So I think it's my very sort of difficult job to close such an insightful webinar. So thank you to all our speakers there. We had attendees from all the way from Morocco down to Cape Town, so really covering the entire Pan-African region. And from what I've seen through the chats, some really good comments, and also some positive feedback in terms of the amount that everyone is learning through the session. When we started to engage with cities in the early days of COVID-19, there was a very big request for this type of webinar, since a lot of people were struggling or grappling with how exactly to communicate to their communities, not only to communicate, but to communicate effectively. So I think this webinar went a long way in terms of providing really hands-on experience, all the way from big research organizations like the IIED down to the actual provincial government, and then also to our local governments that are actually on the ground communicating directly with people within their communities. So maybe just as a closing remark, I'd like to draw on a saying by Confucius: I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And I think a lot of what has been said today is the fact that, especially when we're talking about climate change, this is something that is affecting everyone, and everyone has a big part to play. And I think we can take a lot of that and get people doing rather than just seeing and hearing. So just something to think about when you are planning your communications and going forward. There are a few resources that have been collated for this webinar that contribute to this specific topic. They're available on the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa website, and you'll also find the link in the chat that my colleague Ben has now pasted into the chat if you're interested in those resources. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this forms a part of the Building Sustainable Cities During and After a Pandemic webinar series that is delivered by ICLEI Africa and partners. The next ICLEI Africa webinar will happen next week, and it's focusing on localizing SDGs, and it's on the 1st of September at 2 p.m. Central African time. And the next webinar that is in partnership with the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa is on the 29th of September at 2 p.m. same time, Central African time. And the topic that will be covered there is an access to sustainable energy, a critical component for a green recovery in Africa. So once again, I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar, and I also want to thank the whole webinar team for once again supporting us in putting together a great webinar as part of this series. Thank you, and I wish everyone a good day.